Okay, welcome to our sixth class. We just had a quiz, so the quiz focused mostly on the Bobbitt reading from last week, which actually past 2 weeks. The Bobbitt reading was from a book he published, Philip Bobbitt, who is both a constitutional scholar and a diplomat. He's taught for like a long time in the past 20 years. He has been teaching at University of Texas, Austin, and other institutions. But he was a Foreign Service diplomat in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so that he had a background in Foreign Service, diplomatic relations, and international law, plus also constitutional law. He was a lawyer as well, a teacher at law schools. And in his book, he wrote in 1999 a book called Shield of Achilles. 1999, early 2000 came out. And this was kind of like a mega book. It's like one of these huge 800-page books, monstrosities. And what I took from that, in many ways, it was kind of a response to Fukuyama, but also kind of an agreement with Fukuyama's classic 1991 work, The End of History, arguing for the development of the state. Now, his basic hypothesis, as we talked about, was the Shield of Achilles was all about the transitions of the state, the origins of the concept of the state, the modern state, statecraft, diplomatic relations, and also the crises that were going to come because of globalization. And the book had basically 3 to 4 parts in it. And what I focused on was the second part. The second part of the book, which had what I would call mini constitutional history, a history of the state, okay, and the evolution of the state, where he gives the kind of evolutionary context of the state, and which we talked about as even though the quiz I only asked 5, and that is because I think the market state is something that he postulates as the future of the thing, not as the existing thing. The origins of the state focus in the straightforward way: the princely state, kingly state, territorial state, state nation, and nation state. Now, what is important about the last 2 is the difference of the role of the state nation is when the state, which is i.e. usually the king. Remember that we should always understand that the purpose of the state was tied, for the most part, always to the origins of royal rule, political royal rule. If you know the history of Louis XIV's famous line, "L'estat le moi," I am the state, the idea of the origins of the state and the origins of the concept of, let's say, the term crown, seems to be synonymous concepts. That there was, therefore, the idea here is the princely state, princely rulers or rulers take the modern form of the state to use it to kind of give it a more effective, allow it to be an effective competitor against the other political forms that the world of the Middle Ages or the early Renaissance had, okay? That the state, this new innovative state concept, centralized, homogeneous structure, that was a complete, it was an alternative to a vast plurality of systems that were existing at the time, okay? The older modern concept of civitas, the empire, the new feudal structures that emerged, okay, all these, there's a plurality of models. And what happens with the state, particularly its victory at Westphalia, the state, the political powers that had states, who adapted them and evolved them, were successful against those who did not. Okay, and what the success at Westphalia did, the victorious, or not necessarily victorious, because Westphalia was hardly a victory of one over the other, but most likely it ended up like a victory over one because what happened at Westphalia was that only the state, the concept of the state, and the state itself, states, were seen as the legitimate acting force in the world. Okay, that the only claim of religion, the only actor who had the right to use force or coercion was now going to be the state. In fact, the Catholic Church at the time, had to forego its claim as a legitimate, its power to exercise violence that it had, either through the direct actions of either indirect or directly, and relegate itself to a state, as the papal states. Okay, therefore the churches, in other words, before the Westphalian mentality, the church had a global realm of authority and power, with a exercise of exercising of coercion on issues that it had jurisdiction over, usually issues of heresy and things. In other words, it had global jurisdiction on issues of heresy and issues of religious doctrine and not only religious doctrine also, but behavioral doctrine that conformed to issues of church doctrine and church teaching, which were seen as contrary to Scripture, contrary to the church authority. And it could rightfully exercise coercive power. Now, after Westphalia, even the church had to relegate its authority to state bodies. And the church itself became a state in itself. The Vatican became the church, and the leadership of the church became a physical state, papal states. Okay, the physical body of the state, and only states. And things that were not states had to become, that were still not yet really and historically. You see, what happened here was a kind of legal fiction. Bodies that were still kind of maybe older forms or different structures. Not yet, or maybe even just tribal structures. People were still simply tribal structures. But because of the recognition of them, in other words, the new now rule was that we're going to recognize them as states. Like the Saudis. The Saudis never had a state. The Saudis are still a stateless population. They're a tribal structure of a family, a dynastic family leading over tribes. You can now, what happens in the period of colonial period, not necessarily that, but let's say other people in Africa and Asia, what happened was colonial powers gave to tribal populations and regions states. And this became a problem in a sense. In other words, that became a problem because there is this connection of state and society that Bobbitt likes to talk about, and we have to understand that there is this idea of the state and a society that are kind of commingulous, intersecting as one. And it has to have a unitary society. You cannot have a state with multiple societies in a sense. Because that would always be, if you had multiple societies, if you had a political entity that had multiple societies and a unitary state, then the problem would be that it would be at war with itself. It would not be a homogeneous construction. The body politic of the state is the homogeneous character of the state required that the society have a similar homogeny. So let's go look through the first, that we have this evolution, right? So what was so interesting about this in the state-nation versus nation-state is that a state takes control over a nation. A monarch or a ruler takes possession and exercises all the benefits and resources that a nation or people may have. Okay? And this is the idea that this becomes the political it is through the state that the nation becomes a political viable entity. Prior to that, the nation was at best only a kin relationship, a tribal kin relationship with very weak ability to mobilize, to unify, to things, and that often what would happen is if the various wings of of tribal leaders could not agree, you would have very ineffective authority. Or what would happen is you'd have a kind of breakdown, like on feudal lines of different regional heads of the regions or populations or zones would have more autonomy and more control than, let's say, the person who claimed to represent the whole people, okay? The whole nation. So therefore, the problem with one of the important aspects of this is that the creation of this new centralized state was the centralizing authority of the central ruler, the king, the prince or the king. And therefore, by a princely ruler or a kingly, dynastic king, having not only territorial control but a control of territories, moving to a control over a people, a nation. You see this with the earliest example of this would be at 1066 when William of Normandy conquers England, right? And the establishment of the Norman conquest. And therefore a monarchy of England is now unifiedly ruled and centrally ruled by a political monarch. So a centralized power where all the other aristocracies now, all the subordinate aristocracy is eliminated and now newly recreated under his construction. Okay. The next one would be around the mid to late 15th century with Ferdinand of Aragon in Spain, the unification of Spain through Aragon and the unification of all Spain, the elimination of the Moors, the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, and also the unification of all of Iberia under Aragon, under the reign of Aragon. And the relationship, Ferdinand's marriage to Isabella, therefore Castile and the merging of Castile and Aragon, unifying Spain as a major power. This is a dynastic order. Now, even though he himself, his dynasty dies, and it's his heir marries into another dynastic family, and this dynastic family becomes the dynasty that shapes much of Europe, Habsburg. The Habsburgs, an Austrian family that had a territorial claim near France, that bordered on Spain, married the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, Joanna. She was childless and also mad. He inherited or took control over the monarchy, the dual monarchy. Then what happened was that the Habsburg line establishes its long-term claim, and then because it was one of the claimants, its claims go back to Holy Roman Empire, imperial claims. It eventually becomes elected as through Frederick, and then Charles V becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Habsburgs become the Holy Roman Empire. So in other words, you have Habsburg control both of Spain and of what will become the Holy Roman Empire. At the height of during the height of the 30-year War. Okay. So this is very interesting. This is This is the height of territorial states. The Holy Roman Empire is never a unitary structure. So remember, it is a even though it's an empire, it is basically a empire of regions and of subordinated of regional ducal powers, electors. In other words, that the emperor is elected, dynastic. In other words, if no heir, when the heir dies, there has to be an elector of it. The electors have to agree, and even to a successor, after an emperor dies, and even though he has an heir, the electors can veto, block if he did not have support of the electors. And there's 7 electors. So it's not simply a dynastic order, the Holy Roman Empire, in that sense. So why am I mentioning this? Because this explains the political reality that we are fronted with as we turn into the modern Westphalian world. This transition. And that this idea of states being dominated by states, and at this moment, at this time, you see the rise of certain dynastic rulers, particularly Spain, France. France, you have to remember that for 100 years, France and England, the dynastic claims of Anjou versus the Duke of Anjou and the court around Orleans, which is more Germanic, it's more towards Germany than France, southern France, versus the great grandson of William of Orange. He was Duke of Anjou, the Duke of Anjou, which was Henry II. He becomes King of England, but also Duke of Anjou, also Duke of Normandy, the so-called Plantagenets. Okay, the Plantagenets had in other words, even though they were subordinate, they were a fieful prince to the King of France. The Plantagenets had more power. The Norman Plantagenets had much more power, much more land, much more control, particularly with its control over England. Okay? This Plantagenet Empire. And that therefore, the 100-year war between France and England, where basically England almost to the point controlled France. Remember? With Henry V's famous victory over the French and forcing the French king to renounce his own son, the Dauphin, and appoint the child, Henry V will marry the daughter of the king of France, Elizabeth, I think, yeah, Elizabeth. And then what happens is that, Margaret. And what will happen is their child will be the next king of France. Henry VI will be king of France. Well, Henry VI becomes king, but he becomes king as an infant because Henry V dies. And what happened was England loses France because why? You all know the story, Joan of Arc, right? But what the story about that is that the Dauphin and his establishment of Charles, the Dauphin, will reestablish a new French dynastic monarchy, centralized monarchy. Now this has its problems. The Medicis, is it Medicis or it is Medicis? What is the mother who poisons everyone? In fact, he becomes her son becomes king of Poland and runs away, and then becomes kings of France again. And then her brother-in-law becomes Henry IV, and then the Bourbons become the new family, dynastic family that rules over France, right? The Protestant Bourbon, who then who is the king of Navarre, who then kind of, the famous line, Paris is worth the mass, right? He converts back to Catholicism. He converts to Catholicism to become king of France. And the Bourbon monarchy. So therefore, this idea of, but before that, the victorious Charles of France, who unifies, and the successors of him make France a major power. But it's still much weaker than Spain. Okay, these are the competitors. These are the state nations. These are the kind of dynastic orders who have controls over states. And that what happens with the nation state is when the nation itself seizes control. In other words, the scope of power moves from the king to the nation itself, the people. And the doctrine of popular sovereignty emerges, replaces dynastic. In other words, instead of royal authority and dynastic authority, popular authority, or the people. Popular sovereignty. the great symbol of this is the French Revolution, where what happens is they execute the king, but they do not. What they do? Do they dissolve the state? No, the people are crowned. The people take control over the state, and that therefore it's no longer. That's what I mean. This is the metaphor that they execute the king, and the symbols of monarchical power are just absorbed and transferred to the people. So I mentioned that, and then we mentioned the famous six criteria of state, right? What makes a state? Standing army, centralized bureaucracy, regular taxation, diplomatic representatives abroad, economic policies, like that. State. We can go even here to this next line. This is our next two. What is the two metaphors, right? State as network, and that the state depends on society, right? That's the interconnection of these two concepts. And then last but not least, what are the two okay, hold on. Quit being a bad boy. It wants to go too far. It wants to go. I hate this about this. Come on, go back, right here. It goes to the title here, the brief thesis. What is the two things, the factors that play the interstate constitutional thing? It is what? The interplay between strategic and constitutional innovations that changes the order. So what are the two factors? Strategic innovations and constitutional innovations. What are constitutional innovations? Let's go look at this. This is why the chart is very important and interesting. Now the charts talk about the plates here. These are the constitutional orders, right? And he gives certain events, right? And he talks about that each constitutional order of these, right, had certain. You can see certain events that become kind of the moments, and these moments here, this is like the end point of the realm. So therefore, there's a point where these two intersect in scope and time. Same thing. These two things. You know how they say 1991. I think he's being like this. And Russian Revolution, market state. This is where I think he gets into a little murky waters. But he's right about these points. Inside these moments, they're epochal wars. Epoch wars. The Habsburg-Valois contest. Almost, it's not that long, but the 30-year War, the wars of Louis XIV, the wars of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic, and then the Long War, which is from 1914 to 1990. What does he mean by that? The argument is that World War I and World War II and the Cold War is one war. The events that lead to, in other words, the events that end the Cold War, which is what? The breakup of the Soviet Union, right? And then what happened in 1990, the breakup of Yugoslavia, right? And then the fighting that the re-arising of Serbian nationalism, which what started World War I? Serbian nationalism with the execution of the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. In other words, what began in Sarajevo ends in Sarajevo. With the Serbian and Bosnian Serbian conflict in early 1990s, and the breakup of Yugoslavia and the conflict of Bosnia Herzegovina versus the Serbians in the civil war and within the Bosnian civil war, which wasn't. It was a war between Bosnians, whatever they are, which really means Albanian Muslims, Serbians and Croats. Because the term Herzegovina, that is simply just a leftover from the feudal world. This is a Austrian-Hungarian title. It is a princedom. Bosnia was simply just a label of a region under the Croat and Hungarian control. It was perceived as Serbo-Croatian. At the same time, you had the Turkish Ottoman invasion of that part of the regions. All Balkan areas were conquered by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans brought Islam with it, and mandatory Islam, conversion by the sword. And therefore, what you had was as the collapse of, and we'd have to understand what happened. And the World War I happened because of collapsing of three sick empires. Austria-Hungarian was collapsing because of nationalism. Ottoman Empire was collapsing because of the rise of national identity. And Russian Empire, the three sick men of Europe, Russia, the Tsar, the Austrian Kaiser, and the Ottoman I don't know what is Sultan. Yeah, but by the Sultan it was by the 1900s the Sultan was kind of weak. Now, the Sultan of the late 19th century was not the Sultanate of the 15th and 18th, and even 18th century. Okay. So therefore, this is what this structure here. Now, this is why I mentioned this. Well, let's go look at the constitutional structures. Well, what are these? Well, these are the legitimacy claims, he says, that the princely state, the state confers legitimacy on a dynasty. The kingly state, the dynasty confers legitimacy on the state. So the state becomes a means to create a dynasty. Here, the dynasty legitimizes the state. Here, the state will manage the country efficiently. Therefore, the state becomes the governor structure of territorial rule. The state will forge the identity of the nation. In other words, the king or the monarch or dynastic order. And then the state will better the welfare of the nation. This is the people themselves. The state becomes a tool of the people, right? And then this is his theory about market, is the state will maximize the opportunity of its citizens. Again, this is his conception of market state, which is the least. This is the place where you could argue this is the weakest of his argument. This is tentative. This is not descriptive. But look at this. This is the structure. This is the historic and strategic constitutional innovations, right? Princely state, sectarianism. That means sectarianism means ruled by not the religious order, but the secular order, right? I mean, also sectarian must mean the breakdown of religion. The religion was no longer unified, but divided into sects. Okay? Permanent government. The idea that you have a government, you have a permanent structure. This is the creation of the state. The state creates a permanent body. That is the government. That is the government unified of all the parts, rather than the mere institutions. The tools here, the use of condottieri, that means mercenaries, mobile artillery, and here is the tres Italian. The tres Italian is the Italian style of war, which is kind of more mobile, more kind of like a gamemanship. The rise of kingly states, well, absolutism and secularism, therefore the idea of secular rule, more secular rule, that even though the church may play a role, churchmen may play a role, like Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Massans will be the basic one ruling France during the reign of Louis XIII. But he, as a Catholic prelate, what is he doing? He's helping the Protestant German states to rebel against the Protestant Habsburgs. Why? Even though the Habsburg rulers are Catholic, Habsburg interests are not the interests of the Bourbons. You see that? Therefore, secular interests determine religious loyalty in that sense, or trump religious loyalty. Gunpowder revolution, lengthy sieges, nature of war changes, siege warfare changes, and standing armies, the emergence of standing armies. Then here, territorial states, trade becomes a big instance. Trade, commerce. Aristocratic leadership emerges. In other words, instead of mere dynastic leadership, it becomes the rise of a aristocratic class that becomes a kind of bureaucracy, right? Professional armies. Instead from standing armies to now armies become more professionalized. And then cabinet wars, which now, what are cabinet wars? Is conflicts between the king's advisors and the cabinets themselves fighting for power to be not necessarily taking over the state, but taking over the advising control of the state. The state-nation, well, state-nation is imperialism and nationalism have become the front. In fact, nationalism will be the moment of we see that at this point around here, we can say mass conscription, the emergence of mass conscription, popular armies, decisive battles, the nation. I think this is where I think he does inverse these things a little bit. I would argue that this here, you'd see more of you see the king and nation, the king using the nation to do things. And it's only with the emergence of the nation, and I think this is where I would say he's wrong. His dates are wrong. He puts the rise of the nation state in the later half of the 19th century. I would say it's the starting of the 19th century. The nation states will be nuclear weapons, rapid computation, international communication. Again, this is the things that these are the things that emerge. These are technological. These are kind of technological, military, and this is the ideological, structural, constitutional structures. See how this is the intersection of how these two interconnect. Now, I went over this because today's topic is today's state and regime, and I should have had last week's topic. Is misleading because founders of states, and I said, we really talked about the state. It was more continuation of the state more than anything else, and I kicked myself because I should have changed the title of the thing, and I never did because today's topic is going to be states and regimes, and we're going to talk about this. But I spent a lot of time about the emergence of states here. Today I went over again the Bobbitt thing for you to understand it more fully, to understand these evolutionary structures of states as we move it. We are in the realm of, if we look at the political environment, we exist among states. But we also exist at a time when the state has been calling into question. Why is it called into question? It's because of global communication, global trade. One of the readings, one of the thing I would like to have added reading, if I was going to modify this, I would add a chapter from Hannah Arendt's. Hannah Arendt's Origin of Totalitarianism. There's a chapter in her imperialism chapter where she talks about this breakdown of in other words, the role to understand this moment we're living in is the moment what creates the nation state? What is the factor that really allows monarchs to centralize power to become states, these large nation states? It is commerce, it is trade. What before the creations of the we call the origins of these new dynastic orders, the Middle Ages, the kings always depended upon the aristocrats, his subordinate aristocrats and their property. In other words, that in order for them to raise armies, they would go to this. He would have these people who promised loyalty to him, right? These dukes or barons or lords that made that promised supporting him. Their promise of support will be that they will raise they would raise armies, they would raise soldiers, their knights and their soldiers that they would get from their population. The emergence of standing armies is that, in other words, the feudal world was a very decentralized military. And often what would happen, modern princely rulers, this is why he talks about this, the early princes, relied on mercenaries. Why? Because if they had money, if a prince had money and resources, he could buy the men by hiring soldiers and hiring firms. But the danger of mercenaries are always that the mercenaries are are in it for the money, and therefore they're going to have their own interests. And if they're good and if they're the mercenary captain is, and this is that famous discussion of mercenaries in the Prince. If you have it, the danger of mercenary captains is that what? If he's a good mercenary captain, well, you're in trouble, because if you look at the history, if you know your history, Philip became, Philip, who becomes the conqueror of Greece. He was a stranger who was a kind of guest of the leading, one of the leaders of the Thebans, who then died. But then he took over and became hired as their leader of the Theban military. And what does he do? He established himself as ruler. He's successful. If you have a good mercenary captain who's successful and good, what will happen is, well, you're ruined. Because he will use his military success to take over. And this is the history of, if you know the stories of Syracuse, Hero, you look at all ancient history, the story of a mercenary commander is always led badly. Because if the mercenaries captains, if you fought wars, you'd be lost, but at least you would not, in other words, you'd be safe. Your city will be safe. You wouldn't be successful militarily, but he will never be strong enough or popular enough that he would take over the city. Take over. But a very successful mercenary captain will have not his military success will give him the ability to take over the political order. So mercenaries are a very unlikely, unstable thing. Therefore, but feudal kingdoms is depending on the soldiers of others, depending on the soldiers of your subordinate lords. And what happens if they don't want to fight? I mean, the poor Polish, if you know the story of the Polish king had what? If he himself was not wealthy to pay for his hussars and his troops, he would have to rely upon his subordinate. And if they did not want to give the money or the raise troops, then you were fucked. Standardized standing militaries meant the king had to have a standing military. That's the secret of Prussia. What was the secret of Prussia? Because Prussia was an army. It was an army. It was the successor of the knights. It was always an army. It was an army that possessed the nation. A king with a standing army. That's why the Prussian state was kind of advanced. Prussia was an advanced structure because of an accident that it was really an army that possessed the territory. But Prussia was much more centralized, much more rule. And of the German situations, the story difference between a Prussianized Germany versus Austrian Germany leads to two different fundamental political orders. One effective, one basically ineffective and breaks down. And that it is through the creation of Germany in the 1860s, 1870s, was through Prussia, a centralized, modernized state, not through Austria, a federal, feudal state. And although the German Empire, Germany required compromises, the Lands, its spirit was still Prussian. But it dies. It will die. Everything that the last day of Prussia was 1932. 1932, 1933. The rise of Hitler destroys all. What was left of Prussia was exterminated with the rise of Hitler. And the rise of Hitler is the rise of modern Germany. He is a democratic. He is democratic. Hitler is democratic Germany in its perfect, truest sense. Germany, not Prussia. Germany. So therefore, this is the problem of even this identities of things. That the century we live in now, what happens, Hannah Arendt is very good on this. She says that, look, at the emergence of the nation state emerges as a crisis. That is what? Come on, it's economic. Okay. What happens to a market? I have a market of something. And if is there always infinite profit, infinite good? Can I keep on investing more and getting more?
In theory, yes.
No, not even in theory.
Why?
It's called the law of diminishing marginal returns, diminishing marginal utility. That there's a certain point of utility that there's going to be a limit, and that you're not going to get them. In fact, you'll start getting negative results at a certain point. Again, Pareto optimality problem. Pareto, the Italian economist Vincent Pareto, argued that utility has a certain limit. All utility has a certain limit. And like market, a market is basically a inter-exchange of buyers and sellers. What happens when a market becomes saturated? Okay, price is always dependent upon supply demand, right? What happens when there's too much supply and not enough demand? What's going to happen to price?
Too much supply, then the price will
drop, decline. And what happens? Is there going to be more profit or less profit?
Well, if no one is buying them,
there's no selling, and therefore the profit becomes diminishing, and therefore the opportunities become diminishing. So what happens when all of a sudden something is saturated? Then I don't want to buy any. What happens if everyone has a quote? Everyone has the product, and there's no more need for the product. Are you going to sell more?
No, because everybody has the product.
Okay, so therefore that's complete saturation. In other words, the possibility for growth and growth depends upon when a market becomes saturated, what's going to happen? You're going to get starting negative externalities, right? You're not going to have more growth. So where is remember the princes, the capital markets and the capitalist classes and the development of industrial power, industrial wealth produce the possibility that princely rulers and monarchical states and modern states developed, okay? They had the resources to centralize and make big endeavors, host large militaries, produce social programs en masse. What happens when the economy can no longer, the market is saturated? Where is the market going to want to go? Where there's opportunity. Where is there opportunity? In the developed Western states, or where?
Like right now, where is the opportunity?
Even in 19th century.
19th century opportunity.
Where is the opportunity in 19th century? Where is there big opportunity? Where is the greatest possibility for profits?
I would say minerals and...
No, come on, not even that.
Oil.
No!
Electricity.
What is the most common produced entity there is? Shirts, clothes, goods, merchandise. If you got shirts to sell and things to thing, who is going to be the person that you're going to be able to hawk those shirts? In fact, it's going to be a great market for you to bring new clothes in the clothing market too. Workers, really? Okay. After a certain time, 19th century, the workers have a pretty good enough of them. But what about the third world? What about the developing world?
Well, they're going to need some.
Oh, they're going to need a lot.
Yeah.
And because they need a lot,
Was it more profitable than oil? Or
yes,
electricity?
much more profitable. Selling nooks and goodies for $5. Okay. Selling your oil and those stuff, you make some profit, but it takes too much effort, too much cost?
Because I know from history about the people who got rich after selling oil, not selling gold.
Oh God, selling good. More people become millionaires because of become wealthy by selling products than through selling oil.
Well, and
the oil people make a lot of money that they can become popular, and because of what they sell is so central to political rulers. But the real profit, the real capital investment, starts out through small little manufacturers, production facilities, and that these production facilities make huge capital investments.
Number-wise, yes, I agree.
You understand? So therefore, the opportunity cost, what happens? Okay, now you're a king, you're a state leader. You've come to power because of these capital forces. Do you want these capital forces to now go to the developing world? Do you really want it?
No.
You're afraid of it, right? You're afraid that if the capital forces go to the developing world, then what's going to happen is those developing leaders are now going to get the benefits of this capital development, and I'm not going to get the goodie anymore. I'm not going to get the tax revenue. So how does the 19th century deal with? How does the 19th century state solve this problem? Imperialism. See, this is where Hannah Arendt argues that Karl Marx and not Lenin, but Lenin in his essay Imperialism argued that imperialism is the last stages of capitalism. Arendt argues Mr. Lenin and Marx is full of shit. Imperialism is not the last stage of capitalism. It's the last stage of national control of capital markets. It's the national leaders, national political entities seeking to control capital investors. What they do is they go conquer new territories and say, or make deals. Remember because really the original imperialists were just corporate entities working under king's protections. You go look at all the 16th, 17th century capital, so-called imperialism. They were East India Company. India, the conquest of India by the English. It wasn't the British Crown conquering this. It was a corporation doing this. All the so-called exploration under royal authority were corporate. The Spanish conquistadors were just private enterprise operations under the Spanish crown, who, being good Spanish subjects, submitted it to the royal authority. So if you look at early mercantilist empire, and then the transition from mercantilism to market capital markets. Because why? Mercantilism is inefficient. Capital markets become more effective models of power. This leads to what? More money for the king, more money for the state, kings and states to generate armies and to generate stuff. So 19th century empire was the last gasp of nation states to control capital markets. So what's the 20th century? It's the liberation of capital markets from state control. It's globalism is the liberalization of capital markets through states controls. So capital entities, corporations, and these things are now able to create access to global markets, having more money than many states. And this is the problem of this creates the crisis. This is the crisis of the 20th century. That what happened was that the economic capacity of capitalism broke the state, the nation state. And that there was no possible entity of larger states. World empire was just unfeasible. It didn't work as an empire. You could have world or hegemonic rule, but it was never going to be states. The world, people who talk about a world state, this is the problem with Fukuyama. There's a limit. The limit of the state is that the state requires a society, unitary society. It has to be homogeneous. Sorry, you cannot have a global homogeny of society. Ain't gonna happen. The diversity of humanity, global diversity is too strong. There's going to be too much difference. And with too much difference, there's not going to have the unity, and therefore you're never going to have the unitary, global unity. In other words, it's always going to be fractional, and therefore it always be oppressive. If there was a global state, it would be a tyranny, global tyranny. It could only act tyrannically. A minority would control. In fact, this is the problem. This is the iron law of oligarchy. Any large-scale social organization, the larger the organization, the fewer will actually control. This is why how many of you guys know about the internet story about the 80-20 rule on internet? That the reality of the internet is that really less than 5% of the population controls the messaging of 90% of the messages.
Well, I don't know that theory, but it sounds interesting.
The internet is not democratic. Things like Twitter, global spaces that have the illusion of being mass and popular, but rather it is a very small, like any large-scale social network. What will end up happening is a minority will control. And that what happens is, because monkey see, monkey do. You're monkeys. You're all monkeys in that sense. You want to be part of the group. You want to be liked. Most people want to be liked by the group they're in. They will conform to the group. And therefore, the perception of a thing, people will see something, and what will happen is they will, they think they hear the symbol, and all this talk about what this is. Oh, this must be true. So I believe it. Yay! Most human beings are herd creatures who will simply comply to want to be liked. Will want to like the thing. This is why large-scale social organizations tend to be repressive and controlling. Because why? Because the larger the situation, the actual fewer people you have. And by the way, you have the other problem. That is what? Your sense of relative control. What is the sense of relative control? It's you divide by the n is 1, you 1, the self, you the actor self, divided your relative control over environment is that divided by the number of population in the environment. So if you're in a society that has if your society or community is 1 to 100,000, it's 1 to 100,000. But if your society is 1 to a millionth, which person has more relative control? The 1 to 100,000, 1 to 100,000, or 1 to a millionth?
1 to 100,000.
Yes.
Because it's smaller.
In other words, his perception of his authority and his impact is greater. So the larger the society, the lesser relative perception of power you have, the less feeling of control. So the larger you create your society, the more powerless you feel. And the more necessary to have intermediary institutions between you and that that society or that larger entity. If you don't have intermediating sectors or organizations that you are members of and that will protect you, you are just this one little thing in this huge monstrosity. You feel this is this idea of what Emil Durkheim called atomy, right? The sense that you have powerlessness, that you're powerless, you have nothing, you have no control. This is what this sense that you are alone and isolated, which Tocqueville calls individualism. Individualism in Tocqueville is not a positive thing. It's this isolated sense of self that has no connection to anything else. And that if you're so powerless, then therefore this is the crisis, okay? So this is the crisis of the state in that moment. This is the logical crisis of the state. This is why we are in this moment. We want to say what replaces. What is going to replace the nation state? We think today what we do is we think the nation state, nationalism is bad. Hitler, even though Hitler was not a nationalist. Hitler was a globalist.
Socialist.
No, he was a globalist. An Aryan globalist. He was going to exterminate all other things but the Aryan population was going to be. He wanted to find the true human being, the Aryan, and then exterminate all of the non-Aryan and purify the race. There would be one race, the Aryan, and all the other races would be exterminated in order to achieve would not be polluted by these subordinate inferior beings. All existence. Okay, this is a globalized construction. This is not a nationalism. But the problem is nationalism has been tainted with Hitler. And anything, the surest way to delegitimize Hitler, tie it with Adolf, right? There's a line called reductio ad Hitler. Saying, what is that line on the internet? It's called Godwin's law. The second you bring up Hitler, the argument is lost, right?
We have a famous politician who also likes to mention Hitler when he is criticizing his political opponents, although they have nothing to do with Hitler.
Well, it doesn't make a difference. Everyone can. Yeah. Hitler has become the kind of universal standard that everyone knows is bad. Okay? So if Hitler did it, it's bad. So Hitler liked dogs, therefore liking dogs must be bad. Hitler was a vegetarian, so vegetarians must be bad. Hitler was anti-smoker, so anti-smokers must be bad. Militant anti-smoker. So all you militant anti-smokers, you're Hitler. You know that? This is the problem of such associations in that sense. One of the things I needed to deal today with the problem of founders. Founders is one of those difficult concepts, and this is something that should have been last week. And what are founders? These are people who will create new states, create new people. In other words, creates nations, it creates new political communities. It's both in terms of a creator of a political order, but also creator of now you're American studies people, so we talk about the founders, right? These are the founding fathers, the people who established the American constitutional order, right? The revolutionary generation, the constitutional generation. We speak of these people who helped establish the American constitutional order, okay? This is how we do it. But the term founders go back all the way to the Greek concept of nomothetike, the legislator, the creator of the one who creates the new laws. In fact, the ancient world had more love of this than the modern world. The modern theorist following Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau looks at everything systemically, looks at everything in terms of an organizational pattern of mass behavior. It doesn't really care about individuals. In fact, it wants to minimize the role of individuals. It looks at the organizations of aggregated group behavior. Most social science prefers looking at the role of large-scale aggregated behavior, not individuals. The argument, what role does an individual have, is like, an individual is merely the actor within the larger, in other words, it is, a market or an aggregated behavior or a voting pattern is simply just a whole bunch of people making decisions, right? That when you elect someone for president, what is the impact of any one voter? It's one vote in the scope of total votes, right? How much, can you say that person, that Joe Schmo elected this party? It's hard. Even if it was one vote, even if he wins by one vote, wait a minute, but yeah, that guy's vote, but yeah, all the other people who voted for him, okay, one vote led him to this person have victory. Well, you can't point to any one person there. Oh, you're responsible for him, because it's an aggregated act, right? So therefore we have a problem that modern social science doesn't like to pay attention to the role of the individual actor. But the problem is, in reality, we know, hate to say it, this is where when we look at anyone who studies group behavior, we notice that all of a sudden there's going to be there's always going to be someone who is going to start the behavior, start a trend, start an action, start a behavior, start a something, right? Innovators, usually outliers. They're not in the norm of behavior outcomes. They're usually at either in any trait you have or any distribution, there can be more of the behavior, less of the behavior, good or bad behaviors, right? There's a distribution of behavior. So the tails, the peaks, both negative and positive, innovators and outliers tend to be in the peaks, for good or bad. And you can be an innovator and outlier. You can be someone who innovates or causes something. A bad person, can have as much, can create and alter the reality of the world, can alter behavior as much as a positive person, okay, excessively good person, or successfully beneficial. Okay. So we have to understand, therefore, individuals matter, but it matters in the ability to influence or impact change on the larger behavior of a group dynamic. And we have to understand that still we live in a evolutionary, we don't have a society, okay. Society, I'm going to make the metaphor, society is like giant bunch of amoeba. The world is not one amoeba. It's because of the environmental difference of the world, the amoeba is going to break up into different sects, different regional entities. The amoeba will adapt to the environment. So therefore, there's different populations with different communities. And the environmental structure is motivated by what? The environment you're in, the territorial entities, the ability to feed yourself, to supply yourself, but also to communicate. Transportation and communication enlarges or decreases the ability to move about and interact, will shape the world you are in. And trust me, in the past 200 years, what has happened to our world? It has both increased and decreased at the same time. Huh? 300 years ago, what was the average light? How many miles? What is the standard? About 300 years ago, 500 years ago, what was the average mile or kilometers you traveled routinely that you'd go through? It'd be under 30 kilometers. Most people would barely go more than 100 kilometers outside in their life. Only 5 to 10% of the population will go twice or 300, 500. Very small percentages of the population will go like 1,000 kilometers outside of their world. And usually if they travel that much, they wouldn't come back. Right? So how does language develop? Language develops like any amoeba. It's the back and forth of words. We create words to explain something. So therefore, a language evolved in the same way. As populations spread over a vast area, languages would tend to deviate from each other. Why? Because if you don't have constant daily back and forth, do you know the same words as the other people do? You're more likely you create new words. If you don't hear the same words, like this is like the why among the Inuit peoples are like tens of thousands different words for snow. Because the population experienced them, and therefore they would develop those words to differentiate the snow, but also that because the Inuit people were so divided over space and time, that therefore one Inuit tribe would develop a totally different set of words for the same experience of different types of snow, similar types of snow. So what happened? This is what dialects were. We go to back 300 years ago in Poland. The Polish language was very different in different parts of Poland. Regional dialects, right? What destroys that? What creates uniformity of language? National languages. Printing, one. But also transportation. First horses, then roads, then trains, automobiles, airplanes, then radio, telegraph, radio, and telecommunications. What happens to the world of telecommunications? What destroyed? Okay, grammar, written language homogenized earlier. Written language homogenizes due to print. Written grammar, written languages, written national languages will homogenize with the rise of the print. And great authors who then use the language to shape linguistic, creating the written linguistic uniformed language of a nation or people. But there'll still be there. But even if that happened in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century. So what happens now? But during the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, there still is linguistic dialect. What destroys linguistic dialect? Radio. The radio. Once you have radio and broadcast media, you have now the ability to create a what happens is the ruling dialect will dominate and regional dialects are destroyed, simply are just crushed out of existence. Homogenization. Why? Because those who have the good... What happens to people who don't have the good accent? In England, what happens to people who speak Cockney? In the 19th and 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, having regional accents, what did that do to your economic opportunities? It lowered. So therefore, people
looked down upon and seen as a peasant.
Okay, you see how that works? And then you have like lower opportunities. Therefore, what happens? Evolutionary behavior starts happening. Group selection. Who do you pick as a mate? If you're ambitious and want to have secure that your family is you're going to pick a mate, the mate who speaks received dialect or talks to the local dialect. It's going to trust what happens is the women are, I hate to say this, women are utility maximizers in selection. Your choice is between a mate who is not going to be successful and a mate that will be successful. It's utility organizing to pick some more successful mates. So your children will have optimal opportunities. So what you have is group selection behavior, motivation. Sexual selection leads to group selection, leads to great behavior. What then happens? Language competition. Therefore, what happens to languages, regional languages? They go out of existence. Once you have regional, and oh my God, what happens to global languages? Once you have global economics, and all of a sudden you have situations of people who are you going to make more money? And okay, think of this: are you going to make more money as a manager working for a local Polish firm, or making more money working for a European or international firm? International firm. More economic opportunity, more for management position? Okay, being the slave and the labor thing, but if you're going to be picked for a management team, who's going to have greater access? And by the way, who's going to be picked for language? If you don't speak a global language, you're not going to be picked. So what happens? It becomes group selections. People who adapt to the behavior of group selection, go get into the competition market, get access to what? Because of their behaviors and abilities, they get hired for positions of power and control. And then what then happens? Oh my God. Political wealth and power comes to them. And therefore this creates the problem. Now, founders are, this is the problem, people who founded great societies. This is why in The Prince, we have the famous chapter, book 6 of The Prince. He speaks of the famous 5, Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, the founders of Moses of Israel, Persian Empire, Romulus, Rome, Theseus, Athens, Hero. Now, Carnes Lords in the reading, he gives more. He gives the larger brunt. The founding fathers of the United States, Bolivar for Clan Colombia. Those of you who studied Latin America know Simon Bolivar was the failed. In other words, he's the failed. In other words, they tried in Latin America what they tried in America, but they failed. Grand Colombia, it didn't work. Napoleon, exactly. Napoleon. Bonaparte. Bonaparte and Washington were seen as the great. The difference was Washington. Bonaparte was no Washington. Bismarck. Bismarck is the creator of modern Germany, more than the Kaiser. Modern unified Germany is Bismarck. Victor Emmanuel and Count Cavour of modern Italy, unifying Italy. The Meiji reformers, Japan. For Turkey, come on, Kemal Ataturk, come on. Radical modernizer. The important role, without the rise of these individuals become this. Now, Edward Shevardnadze, which the Soviet foreign secretary and foreign affairs diplomat during the end of the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev, he becomes the head of the modern Georgia, creates modern Georgia. And you can say the same thing with Kuchma and Kuchma in Ukraine, but also Lukashenko in Belarus. These dictatorial. Come on, how are they different from Ataturk? In many ways, they're similar to Ataturk. These authoritarian dictatorial rulers. Lenin and Hitler, Ayatollah Khomeini. These are I call it Lenin, Hitler, and Ayatollah Khomeini, the triumvirate of ideological founders of orders. And then last but not least, Charles de Gaulle, the creation of the Fourth Republic, the Fifth Republic. Sorry, not Fifth, it's Fifth Republic. I always say Fourth, but the Fifth Republic. He decides the Fourth Republic is reestablished after reestablished the Second World War. From the Third Republic, what ends up happening is that, the Algerian crisis led to a crisis that he then calls in and creates a new constitutional order and totally changes France to a presidential system and a bureaucratic presidential model. And in other words, modern France is kind of a devolution from Gaullist France. These are the great leaders. Now, in our last couple of minutes, constitutional. The one last thing is the states, and that's going to be our next discussion. States. In fact, I'm almost going to say, I can't give you a quiz next week because the problem with states, regimes, it's that the modern states and the concept of regimes. What are regimes? Regimes are simply just institutional orders of a state, like a constitution. We understand constitutions in 3 ways. The functions of, in other words, constitutions exist in 3 essential elements, in a sense. Functions of government, the powers and responsibilities that reside in the public rather than the private sphere. In other words, what is the functions of government? 2, the structures of government, the institutions and mechanisms that constitute the political framework. And 3, the procedures of government, the procedural rules, the manners in which government's carrying out the powers and responsibilities. So therefore, functions, therefore the powers and responsibilities. 2, the institutions and mechanisms, the structure of the government, the structure. So it's functions, structure, and procedures. These are this is what constitutionalism always has understood within it. A constitution and constitutional orders. And the regime is kind of like the constitution. The origins of the concept of regimes come from the ancient Greek, politeia, It has a double meaning. The double meaning of it is it is both its general form or system. It's a system. Politeia is a kind of a system, a structure. It has the similar structure of this, but it also means a particular one. Okay, it's therefore a general concept, but also a particular variety of it. The argument is a particular form of a politeia in that sense. There's no exact Latin term for it. Res publica, which is the republic, was the term that is the closest to it, towards it, which came to mean and res publica, the public thing, right? Thing, res publica, and therefore it came to mean but the problem with this is the republic came to mean a particular form of rule rather than the system. We speak of the republic, so therefore it becomes a particular form, not the system, even though the word you meant to do it was politeia. The term constitution emerged into the English from the French. The term constitution can be seen to be misleading, as constitutions is often too formally tied to written constitutions and written legal norms. And what Aristotle is referring to here, or the ancient order is referring to, as constitution is much broader. Remember, the problem is the original word constitution meant you'd have a constitution. Every one of us would have a constitution. That's our health, our well-being. It was not just, in other words, the term constitution became totally, in our mind, reduced to the legal instrument. Okay, this is why using the word to call politeia constitution is problematic, because we tend to linguistically reduce the term constitution to its legalistic form. Okay, parchment, the document, the law. Whereas the Constitution was the original word of Constitution meant something far broader. It was your health, your state, your condition. You'd go for a morning constitutional, your morning walk, right? You would do stuff for your health. It was about your health, your status, your condition. Other terms that are substituted for constitution are constantly government. You can translate it as a political system, but latticed regime, and this is where we leave it off. We'll stop here. We'll return to come more stuff about this, about the regime and the secular regime. So I'll see you guys next time.